The snow fell in large flakes, covering the rocky terrain of the mountain like a silent blanket. The car wound its way through the narrow roads, climbing higher and higher. The trees around, already heavy with ice, formed a white and imposing landscape, almost suffocating. Inside, the silence between the three occupants was broken only by the steady sound of the engine, struggling against the biting cold. Tom, at the wheel, kept his eyes fixed on the road, focused on every treacherous curve. He had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be an escape from routine, one last adventure before winter took full control of the mountain. But the weather wasn't on their side. The forecast had changed in the past few days, warning of a powerful storm that could hit the region at any moment. Still, he had insisted. The cabin was isolated, but equipped with supplies and a fireplace. Nothing a little planning and caution couldn't handle. Next to Tom, Jess watched the landscape with her arms crossed. She used to love these trips. The feeling of freedom that came from being so far away from everything. But something about this mountain felt different. The silence of the trees, the oppressive weight of the cloudy sky. A sense of unease had settled in her chest since they started ascending, and she couldn't shake it. Maybe it was just the looming storm. Or maybe it was something else. In the back seat, Daniel sat quietly. He had always been the most reserved of the three, preferring silence to lively conversations. His eyes were fixed on a point outside, while his fingers tapped rhythmically on the notebook he carried with him. He, too, had insisted on coming, even after the weather forecasts had taken a turn for the worse. There was a strange calmness in his demeanor, as if nothing could rattle him. That unnerved Jess, though she couldn't pinpoint why. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the darkness was already setting in. The place was simple, an old wooden structure surrounded by tall pine trees. The fireplace was already stocked with wood, and the inside of the cabin offered the welcoming warmth they needed. Tom lit the fire, and the flames soon began crackling, casting shadows across the wooden walls. The wind outside began howling more fiercely. Tom checked the cabin's radio to hear the latest weather updates. The forecast had worsened. The storm was going to be stronger than expected, with winds powerful enough to bring down trees and temperatures set to drop far below freezing. He switched off the radio and looked at the others, unsure whether to share the news. "Everything okay?" Jess asked, sensing the weight in Tom's silence. "Yeah, just the weather getting uglier," he replied, trying to sound calmer than he actually felt. Jess moved toward the window. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind whistled through the trees. She felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. Outside, the darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the sense of isolation deepened. The world felt distant, as if they were completely alone in that place. But then she saw it. Jess squinted, trying to focus on something outside. There was a trail, footprints. Footprints leading from the forest toward the cabin. Her heart raced. There was no way that could be right. None of them had left since they arrived. She backed away from the window, trying to stay calm, but the fear inside her was growing. "Tom. I think you should see this." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He approached and looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as he realized what she was seeing. Footprints, clear and distinct, cutting through the pristine snow, leading straight to the cabin door. Footprints that shouldn't have been there. Daniel didn't move from the sofa. He simply glanced up briefly, as if what was happening was just another minor inconvenience. Tom looked at him, but nothing was said. The wind outside seemed to blow harder, almost like a warning. The storm was just beginning. The sight of the footprints made the air inside the cabin feel heavier. The wind outside roared like a wild beast, but the silence within the wooden walls left Tom uneasy. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the trail marked in the snow, leading directly to the door. No matter how hard he tried to think of a logical explanation, nothing made sense. No one left the cabin, Tom muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the situation. Jess, standing beside him, seemed equally unable to look away, her eyes wide with the fear she was trying to suppress. Daniel's silence, still unmoving on the sofa, only added to the growing tension. He hadn't even shown curiosity about what the other two were seeing outside. It was as if those footprints were a trivial detail to him, a minor inconvenience amid the growing chaos of the storm. Tom finally stepped away from the window and pulled on his coat, determined to figure out what was happening. "I'm going out to check," he said, pulling a hat over his head. "Are you crazy?" Jess snapped, grabbing his arm tightly. "It's dark, and the storm's getting worse. And those footprints, we don't know who or what could be out there." Tom hesitated for a moment, feeling the tension in Jess's grip. She was right. But the mystery of the footprints gnawed at him. He had to see it for himself. "I'll just take a quick look," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I won't go far." He opened the door and was met with the biting cold of the wind. The sound of the storm was almost deafening outside. Snow whipped against his face as he took his first steps toward the footprints. Each step sank deep into the fresh snow, the sense of isolation growing with every inch. The footprints were clear, sharp as if someone had just passed by. They came from the edge of the forest and stopped right at the cabin's door. There were no returning tracks. Whoever, or whatever, had left those marks was still out there. Tom stopped, staring into the darkness of the trees surrounding the cabin. The beam from the flashlight he held barely penetrated the swirling snow. The feeling of being watched closed in around him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the rising panic. There was nothing out there. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. He hurried back to the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Jess looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for an explanation he couldn't give. "The footprints, they start in the forest and stop here," he said, breathless. "But there's nothing. Whoever made them, they're still out there." The tension inside the cabin ratcheted up another notch. The wind outside wasn't helping. The sound of trees bending under the storm's force seemed to echo inside Jess's head. She paced back and forth, unable to calm down. Daniel, on the other hand, remained indifferent. He hadn't moved a muscle since Tom had returned. He just watched, that distant look in his eyes, as though nothing happening around them mattered. "This doesn't make any sense," Tom muttered, moving toward the radio, hoping for some new update on the storm. But only static greeted him. No voices, no news. Just the endless crackle that only made the sense of isolation more pronounced. "Maybe it was some lost hunter," Jess suggested, grasping at any rational explanation that might ease the growing fear. "Someone who passed by, saw the cabin, and left. It could be that, right?" Tom wanted to believe that. He wanted to think what they were dealing with was something explainable. But logic was unraveling quickly in the face of the deepening mystery. He glanced again at Daniel, who was now calmly flipping through his notebook, as if nothing around them mattered. "Daniel, any idea what this could be?" Tom asked, trying to draw out some kind of reaction. But Daniel only looked up for a brief moment and shrugged. "Whatever it is," he finally said, "it's not out there anymore. I saw the footprints, too. They stopped at the door. And if there aren't any more, then whatever made them came inside. And didn't leave." The silence that followed Daniel's words was almost suffocating. Jess looked at Tom, panic returning full force. The idea that something, or someone, could be inside the cabin with them was unbearable. Had they locked the door? She couldn't even remember anymore. Maybe they had. Maybe they hadn't. But if they locked it now, would it even matter? The static from the radio continued, relentless, while the storm howled outside as if the world beyond was crumbling around them. The cold inside the cabin seemed just as intense as outside. Even with the fire crackling, there was something much more chilling in the air: distrust. Daniel's words echoed in Tom's and Jess's minds. If something or someone had come in, it was still with them. The heavy silence that followed made even the crackling of the wood sound menacing. Jess hugged herself, pacing in small circles, as if every movement could push away the dark thoughts tightening in her mind. Tom couldn't stop looking at Daniel. There had always been something off about him, a guardedness that had never broken, even after years of friendship. What had started as a simple trip to relieve the pressure of daily life now felt like a silent trap. Something about this mountain, this cabin, wasn't right. And each passing second made it harder to ignore the growing doubts within him. He recalled how Daniel had insisted they come to the cabin, even when the weather forecasts started to worsen. While Tom hesitated, concerned for their safety, Daniel remained unusually calm, almost indifferent to the risk. Now, with the mysterious footprints and the crushing silence of the night, Tom began to wonder why exactly Daniel had been so insistent. Jess stood in front of the fire, lost in her thoughts, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Her heart had been racing ever since she'd seen the footprints. Something about the cabin had bothered her from the moment they arrived, and now her suspicions were growing. She started to wonder if she really knew Daniel at all. He'd always been reserved, but this coldness, this detachment from the situation, it was as if he knew something they didn't. "What are you hiding, Daniel?" The words slipped out before she could stop herself. Daniel looked up from his notebook, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond right away, just stared at Jess as though weighing the situation, deciding whether it was worth revealing anything. Tom watched the exchange, feeling the tension build like a rope ready to snap. Jess wasn't going to drop the question. "Hiding?" Daniel finally repeated, his voice tinged with amusement. "Nothing you can't handle." The answer twisted Jess's stomach. There was something deeply unsettling in the way Daniel spoke, as if everything was a game and they were just pawns with no control over the board. Tom stepped forward, placing a hand on Jess's shoulder, trying to calm her down. "Let's just focus on what's happening here. This isn't the time for fighting." But the truth was that Tom was just as unsettled. He was trying to keep the peace, but his doubts about Daniel were growing. He tried to recall how they had even become close friends. Daniel had always been mysterious, yes, but Tom had always seen him as reliable, someone who didn't let his emotions show. Now, everything seemed like a facade. The radio crackled again, breaking the silence and causing all three of them to flinch. Tom hurried over, adjusting the dial, hoping for a signal, any sign of news. But again, just static. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse. The wind howled louder, thrashing against the cabin. Jess stepped away from the window, feeling more trapped than ever on this mountain. The sound of the storm blended with something else, something subtle but undeniably present, a sound that made her heart race. It was distant, quiet, but definitely there. "What if this isn't just a storm?" she whispered, almost to herself. Tom looked up from the radio, concerned by the tone in her voice. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she replied, hesitantly. "There's something more. It doesn't feel right. Ever since we got here, it's felt like something's watching." Daniel, still with his notebook, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Tom sighed, trying to keep control of the situation. It was true there was something unexplainable about the atmosphere, but he needed concrete answers. Looking at Daniel again, Tom decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. He needed clarity. "Daniel," Tom said firmly, "why did you bring us here even when all the warnings about the storm came out? What was the rush?" Daniel slowly closed his notebook as if every movement was calculated. He looked at Tom and Jess, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes, certain places have a purpose. And certain people need to be in places like this to understand things they wouldn't anywhere else. Jess stared at him, her voice trembling. "What the hell does that mean? What are you trying to say?" Daniel took a deep breath, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "This thing, it found us. I knew one day it would happen. I brought you here because I needed witnesses. You needed to see with your own eyes. There's no escaping it. I tried once before." Tom was about to ask what he meant, but the sound of scratching at the door interrupted. Light, like claws scraping against the wood. Jess froze, her face losing all color. Tom moved instinctively toward the door, heart pounding, but Daniel remained still, as if he'd been expecting this. Tom grabbed the doorknob, the scratching sound continued, more persistent now. He took a deep breath and, with a swift motion, threw the door open. Darkness greeted him, along with a blast of freezing wind. There was nothing out there. No sign of whoever or whatever had been scratching. Just the storm, roaring like a living creature. He slammed the door shut and turned back to the others. Jess was pale, her eyes locked on Daniel. Something had shifted. The tension in the room was unbearable now. No explanation would make sense, and worst of all, Tom was starting to doubt if any of them would leave this cabin with their sanity intact. The scratching at the door had been real, but the feeling that they were caught in something much larger than the storm outside was far more palpable. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, pounding against the windows of the cabin with increasing fury. Inside, the silence between the three friends grew unbearable. Jess and Tom stayed close to the fireplace, as if the light and warmth could somehow ward off the darkness creeping in. Daniel, on the other hand, had drifted further away, both physically and emotionally. He was absorbed in his notebook, flipping through its pages almost mechanically, detached from everything around him. Minutes felt like hours, until Jess, exhausted from the tension, finally dozed off in a light sleep, slumped in one of the armchairs. Tom remained awake, his eyes locked on Daniel. Something was wrong. He knew it, but he still couldn't fit all the pieces together. What did Daniel know that they didn't? That was when Tom realized Daniel was missing. He glanced around the cabin and saw that the spot where Daniel had been sitting was now empty. The notebook had been left open on the table, but Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He stood up abruptly, the movement waking Jess, who sat up straight, startled by the worried look on his face. "Daniel's gone," Tom murmured, panic lacing his voice. Jess blinked, trying to process what he had just said. The fear she had managed to push aside for a brief moment came rushing back with full force. She looked around the cabin too and saw that Daniel had indeed disappeared, leaving only his open notebook behind. Without hesitation, Tom snatched the notebook from the table and began flipping through it. The pages were filled with scribbles, cryptic diagrams, and fragmented sentences, but one thing caught Tom's attention. An old photograph, tucked between the pages, which he pulled out with trembling fingers. Both he and Jess stared at the image, shock sweeping over them. The photo showed Daniel, clearly younger, standing next to Jess. The most disturbing part was that Jess had no memory of ever knowing Daniel at that time. What could that photo possibly mean? "This doesn't make sense," Jess muttered, turning the photo over in her hands as if searching for a hidden explanation. I never knew him before, not back then. Tom felt the weight of the situation grow heavier. Something was very wrong. He had always known Daniel was reserved, but this went beyond mere secrecy. Looking back at the notebook, he saw more strange symbols and sentences that seemed to form some kind of code or instructions. The feeling of being trapped in a much larger scheme grew stronger, but they still didn't know who was pulling the strings. "We have to find him," Tom said, his voice determined. Jess, still shaken, nodded in agreement. They couldn't let Daniel stay out there alone, especially now that they knew he was hiding something important. Both of them quickly bundled up in heavy coats and gloves to face the biting cold outside. The storm had grown fiercer, but they had no choice. They stepped out of the cabin, braving the brutal wind and the snow that was coming down harder than ever. Daniel's footprints were visible, leading toward the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. Why would he go there? Jess asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Tom had no answers, only the drive to follow the trail. Every step felt harder than the last, with the snow biting at their faces like tiny blades. They knew they didn't have much time before the cold would overpower them. After several minutes of trudging through the snow, they finally spotted Daniel in the distance. He was standing still, unmoving, in the middle of a small clearing among the trees. Tom called out his name, but there was no response. Daniel seemed to be in a trance, his eyes fixed on something that Tom and Jess couldn't yet see. As they got closer, they noticed that Daniel was holding another photograph in his hands. Tom approached cautiously, calling out to him again, but Daniel didn't move. When Tom finally touched Daniel's shoulder, his friend slowly turned, his eyes vacant. He silently held out the photo. Tom took it, and what he saw made his heart stop for a moment. The picture showed Jess and Daniel again, but this time there was a third figure in the background. A shadowy, indistinct figure, barely visible, watching them from afar. "What does this mean, Daniel?" Tom demanded, his voice full of frustration and fear. But Daniel simply shook his head slowly, as though the explanation was beyond words. "This has happened before," Daniel finally said, his voice hollow. "And it's going to happen again." Before Tom or Jess could process what he had just said, a deep, guttural sound echoed through the forest. All three of them froze, their eyes scanning the darkness around them. Something was moving between the trees, large and deliberate. Fear surged through Tom's veins as he grabbed Jess's arm, pulling her back. "We need to get back now," he said, urgency lacing his voice. Without waiting for a response, the three of them ran back toward the cabin, the menacing sound still echoing through the forest behind them. The wind seemed to push them forward with violent force, as if chasing them. When they finally reached the cabin, they slammed the door shut, their breaths ragged with panic. The photograph was still in Tom's hand, and the realization that they were caught in something far bigger than they had imagined became nearly unbearable. Back inside the cabin, the cold from outside seemed to seep into the room. Tom slammed the door shut, but the sound of the wind howling outside didn't let them forget what was in the forest. The air inside the cabin was heavy with fear, and the small space, once a shelter from the storm, now felt like a prison. Jess was trembling, not just from the cold but from the series of events unraveling before them. She looked at Daniel, waiting for an explanation, but he remained silent, his eyes distant as if he were somewhere else entirely. Tom, however, kept staring at the photo still in his hand. That shadowy figure in the background of the old picture, always there in the photos of Daniel and Jess, seemed to hold the key to everything. But how did it all connect to what was happening now? What did Daniel mean when he said, "This has happened before"? The crackling of the fire was the only sound inside the cabin, as the three of them stood frozen in their own thoughts. But the silence was soon interrupted by a noise from outside. A soft scraping, like claws scratching against the wooden walls. Jess froze where she stood, her eyes wide. Tom moved quickly to the window, trying to see something in the dark. But the glass was fogged up from the cold, and the storm made it impossible to see clearly outside. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded, not taking his eyes off the window. "It's out there." "It's close," he said, his fear clear in his voice. Daniel, standing by the table, seemed eerily calm. He didn't approach the window or show any sign of alarm. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment. Tom moved away from the window and stared directly at Daniel, demanding answers. "You knew. You knew this was happening. You brought us here for a reason. So, what's going on?" Tom finally exploded, his frustration spilling over. "What is that thing out there, Daniel?" For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. His eyes swept over the room, as if organizing his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost emotionless. "I told you, this has happened before," he began. "This cabin, it's not just a shelter. It's a meeting point. A place where time and space blur, where the boundaries between what's real and what lies beyond dissolve. I didn't realize it until the last time I was here." Daniel's words sounded like something out of a nightmare, but deep down, Tom knew there was a dark truth to them. The cabin had always felt strange, but now, under the threat of the thing outside, the place seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't fully grasp. "The last time you were here?" Tom repeated, trying to make sense of it all. "With who?" Daniel took a deep breath, as if he were about to reveal something he had kept hidden for a long time. "I came here with another group, years ago. People, just like you, who didn't know what this place was. We thought it was a simple getaway from our daily lives. But, it happened. Just like it's happening now. The storm, the footprints, the feeling of being watched, and then, the thing out there. It came for us." "You're saying this is a cycle?" Tom asked, feeling a sense of understanding slowly clicking into place. "It happens to everyone who comes here?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I was the only one who survived. But I didn't leave without scars. Since then, the cabin has been calling me back. I knew one day I'd have to return, that I'd have to face it again. And I knew I couldn't do it alone." Jess stared at him, disbelief and horror crossing her face. "So you brought us here to be part of this? To die with you?" "It's not like that," Daniel answered quickly, for the first time showing a flicker of emotion. "You needed to see. You needed to understand what's beyond our comprehension. But yes, there's a price. There's always a price." Tom stepped forward, gripping the axe tighter in his hand, but now, instead of pointing it at the door or window, he aimed it at Daniel. "What's the price, Daniel? What are you still hiding from us?" Daniel hesitated, looking into Tom's eyes, as though unsure whether he should tell the full truth. But finally, he sighed and let the heavy secret out. "She wants sacrifices. She wants someone to stay behind, so the others can leave. That's how I survived the last time. I tricked her, distracted her with others. But now she's back, and she wants what was promised." The silence that followed was suffocating. Tom looked at Jess, his heart pounding. Sacrifice? Was that what Daniel had been planning all along? To offer one of his friends to this thing so he could escape again? The rage inside Tom began to boil. Daniel had orchestrated everything from the start. He had used them as bait. "You're not going to sacrifice us," Tom said, his voice firm. "If anyone makes it out of here alive, it's going to be because we fought our way out. We're not part of your plan." The air grew heavier, and before Daniel could respond, a new loud crash shook the cabin. The door creaked under a massive force pressing against it. Tom looked at Jess, who was already backing away from the entrance, and then at Daniel, who simply moved back slowly, as though distancing himself from something he knew he couldn't face. Tom took the lead. "Stay behind me," he said to Jess, gripping the axe tightly, trying to project more confidence than he felt. His heart pounded in his chest as each second stretched into an unbearable weight. The door shook again. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate with the impact, and the sound of wood splintering filled the air. Tom glanced desperately at Daniel, but there was nothing left to say. Daniel knew their fate was sealed. He had brought them here, and now, they were all going to face the same horror. Finally, the door gave way. A huge hole opened up, and the darkness from outside seemed to breathe, alive, pulsating. The wind tore into the room, but there was something else. A shadow moved among the wreckage, an indistinct, massive figure that seemed to crawl inside. The sound it made was deep, a low growl that made Tom's blood run cold. Jess screamed, backing into the corner of the cabin. Daniel didn't move, only stared at the creature as if he had been waiting for this all along. Tom, however, stepped forward with the axe raised, ready to attack. But the thing stared at him. Its eyes, or what he thought were eyes, glowed faintly, almost spectral, and suddenly, the air around them grew thick and heavy, as if reality itself were folding in on itself. The glass of the window continued to crack, the pressure outside growing stronger. Tom gripped the axe so tightly that his fingers had gone white. Jess remained curled in the corner, her wide eyes fixed on the door, as if at any moment something would break through. Daniel's silence, however, was the most unsettling of all. He didn't seem scared, nor nervous. His face held an almost unnatural calm, as if all of this was inevitable, as if he'd known the outcome long before it started. "Daniel," Tom growled through gritted teeth, his eyes still on the window. "You need to tell us what's going on. What is that thing outside? And why did you bring us here knowing this would happen?" Daniel kept his gaze on the flames of the fireplace, the flickering light dancing on his face. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, absorbed by something Tom and Jess couldn't comprehend. But finally, he spoke, his voice low and without emotion. "I didn't bring you here out of malice," he began. "You needed to see. You needed to understand what this place is, what it's always been." "See what?" Jess cut him off, barely holding back her tears. "That we're all about to die? That we're just pawns in some sick game?" Daniel looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes reflected something new. A mixture of resignation and perhaps regret. This cabin, it's not just a refuge. It's a meeting point. A place where time and space overlap, where the boundaries between what's real and what lies beyond start to blur. I didn't discover that until the last time I came here. Daniel's words felt like something out of a nightmare, but deep down, Tom knew there was a grim truth to them. The cabin had always felt strange, but now, under the threat of that thing outside, the place seemed to throb with an energy he couldn't fully understand. "The last time you were here?" Tom repeated, still trying to make sense of it all. "With who?" Daniel took a deep breath, as if he were about to confess something he had kept buried for years. "I came with another group, years ago. People who, just like you, had no idea what this place was. We thought it would be a simple escape from everyday life. But then, it happened. Just like it's happening now. The storm, the footprints, the feeling of being watched, and then, the thing outside. It came for us." "You're saying this is a cycle?" Tom asked, slowly piecing it together. "It happens to everyone who comes here?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I was the only one who survived. But I didn't leave without scars. Ever since then, the cabin has been calling me back. I knew one day I'd have to return, that I'd have to face it again. And I knew I couldn't do it alone. Jess looked at him, horrified. So you brought us here to be part of this? To die with you? It's not like that, Daniel responded quickly, his voice breaking for the first time. You needed to see. You needed to understand what's out there, beyond our comprehension. But yes, there's a price. There's always a price. Tom took a step closer, gripping the axe, but this time, not aiming it at the door or window, he was pointing it at Daniel. What's the price, Daniel? What are you still hiding from us? Daniel hesitated, staring at Tom as if unsure whether to speak the full truth. Finally, he sighed, the weight of his secret heavy on his shoulders. She wants sacrifices. She wants someone to stay behind, so the others can leave. That's how I survived last time. I distracted her with others. But now she's back, and she wants what was promised to her. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom glanced at Jess, his heart pounding. Sacrifice? Was that what Daniel had been planning all along? To offer one of his friends so he could escape again? Anger boiled up inside Tom. Daniel had orchestrated everything from the start. He had used them as bait. You're not going to sacrifice us, Tom said, his voice thick with determination. If anyone gets out of here alive, it's because we fought our way out. We're not part of your plan. Daniel seemed defeated, as if he already knew they wouldn't accept his words. He glanced at the door, where the scratching noise had begun again. She's already chosen, he said, his voice barely audible. You can try to run, but the end will be the same. I tried running before, and I paid the price. Jess was trembling, her voice barely a whisper. What do we do? She asked Tom. We can't just stay here and wait for that thing to kill us. Before Tom could respond, the window shattered with a loud crack. Something was forcing its way in, and the cabin felt more vulnerable than ever. They had to make a decision, and fast. The sound of the glass shattering echoed through the cabin like a final alarm. The cold wind tore through the room, clashing with the warmth of the fire, and with it came the undeniable sense that whatever had been hunting them was about to break in. Tom gripped the axe tighter, his mind racing for any plan that could keep them alive. Jess was frozen in place, her wide eyes locked on the spot where the glass now lay in shards on the floor. Daniel, as always, stood in disturbing silence. The air around them seemed to throb. The wind carried a deep, almost human-like howl, but it was unmistakably monstrous. It was a presence, something real, something pressing against the cabin walls. That thing outside was about to breach the physical barrier that separated them, and they knew that the confrontation was inevitable. Tom, Jess whispered, her voice trembling with fear. What do we do? He had no answers. His mind spun, desperately searching for a solution, but nothing made sense. It was impossible to fight what they couldn't fully see. Looking at the axe in his hands, the weapon seemed pitifully inadequate for whatever was coming. Daniel, on the other hand, looked resigned, as if he had accepted the fate about to consume them. She won't stop, Daniel said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the howling wind. I tried to run last time, but she found me. She always finds me. And now, you're part of this too. There's no escape. You brought us here to die? Tom spat, the anger burning in his throat. You knew this from the beginning and used us as bait? Daniel stared at him without emotion, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames from the fireplace. I needed witnesses. And yes, I needed a chance to survive. There's no tricking this thing without a sacrifice. Tom felt the desperation grow inside him. The word sacrifice echoed like a sentence, something final and irreversible. He knew that Daniel had made his decision long before they even reached the cabin. His plan had always been this: to use them so he could escape again, like he had with the previous group. But Tom wasn't going to let that happen. "You're not going to sacrifice us," Tom said, his voice filled with grim determination. "If anyone gets out of here alive, it'll be on our own terms. We're not part of your sick game." The air grew even heavier, and before Daniel could respond, a fresh crash shook the cabin. The door groaned under a massive force pounding against it. Tom glanced at Jess, who was already backing away from the entrance, and then at Daniel, who slowly stepped back as though distancing himself from something he knew couldn't be stopped. Tom moved in front of Jess. "Stay behind me," he said, gripping the axe tightly, trying to project confidence he didn't truly feel. His heart hammered in his chest as every second stretched unbearably. The door trembled again. The cabin seemed to shake with each impact, and the splintering wood filled the air with sharp, crackling sounds. Tom shot a desperate look at Daniel, but there was nothing more to say. Daniel had brought them here, and now they would all face the same horror. Finally, the door gave way. A huge hole opened, and the darkness outside seemed to breathe, alive, pulsing. The wind crashed into the room, but there was something more. A shadow moved among the wreckage, a massive, indistinct figure that seemed to crawl into the cabin. The sound it made was low, a deep growl that sent a chill down Tom's spine. Jess screamed, backing away into the corner of the room. Daniel didn't move, simply watching the creature as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Tom, on the other hand, stepped forward with the axe raised, ready to fight. But the thing looked directly at him. Its eyes, or what he assumed were eyes, glowed faintly, an eerie, spectral light, and suddenly, the air around them felt thick and heavy, as though reality itself was bending. Tom felt his body freeze, unable to move. It was as if time had slowed, and the thing crept closer to him, slow, deliberate. The terror inside him grew with every passing second, but his body refused to respond. The creature was just a few feet from him now, its growl vibrating in his ears, when an unexpected voice broke through the silence. "Take me," Daniel said, stepping forward. "This is what you wanted all along. I'm the sacrifice." Tom watched helplessly as Daniel moved toward the creature, his expression unflinching, as if he had long ago accepted his role. The creature stopped for a moment, as if considering the offer, and then, without warning, surged toward Daniel, wrapping him in the thick shadows that surrounded it. The scream that followed was low, guttural, but brief. Within seconds, Daniel was gone, swallowed by the darkness that began to slowly recede, pulling away like a tide after a storm. The silence that followed was crushing. The cabin, now broken and exposed to the storm, felt empty, save for Tom and Jess. The presence that had once suffocated them had vanished, leaving only the cold and the sound of the wind. Tom dropped to his knees, the axe slipping from his grip as Jess sobbed quietly in the corner, unable to find the words to express the horror they had just witnessed. The creature was gone. Daniel had been the sacrifice, but at what cost? The silence in the cabin was so deep that the wind outside seemed distant, almost unreal. Tom was still on his knees, his breathing heavy in the now empty space. Jess, curled up in the corner, was quietly sobbing, the sound muffled by the shock that clung to them both. Daniel had disappeared into the darkness, taken by that thing, and the cabin, which once felt like a refuge from the storm, now felt like a tomb. The sacrifice had been made. The presence that had once pressed down on them had lifted, but the lingering sense of something terrible still hovered in the air, like Daniel's shadow was still there, trapped in that cursed place. Tom slowly rose to his feet, his body aching and his mind numb. The image of Daniel's sacrifice still played over and over in his mind, and the guilt of letting him go weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure if they should think of Daniel as a hero or a manipulator, but the truth was Daniel had accepted his fate, perhaps knowing all along that this was inevitable. The creature had taken what it wanted, and as terrifying as it was, they were alive. "Jess," he murmured, stepping closer to her. "We need to leave." She looked up at him, her eyes still wet with tears, but she forced herself to stand. The fear still gripped her, but the urgency to leave the cabin, and everything that had happened there, was stronger. Tom helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the door. The storm outside had quieted, as though the force that had driven it had disappeared along with Daniel. They stepped outside into the freezing cold, the wind still biting at their skin, but the world seemed calmer now. The snow was still falling, but gently, almost peacefully, as if the storm's fury had been tamed. The trees around them were covered in ice, their branches bending under the weight, but the sound of the threatening wind was gone. The sense of being watched, which had followed them since arriving at the cabin, had also vanished. They began walking toward the path that would lead them back to the road, their boots sinking into the soft snow. Each step felt like an immense effort, but now there was a flicker of hope that they could escape. The sun was starting to rise on the horizon, casting a pale light across the sky, as if the world was being reborn after the long night of terror. But the weight of what they had left behind still hung over them. The memory of Daniel, of what he had done, lingered in their minds. Tom tried to focus on each step, but the echo of Daniel's words, "She always finds me," wouldn't leave him. What was that thing? Why had it chosen them? And more importantly, were they truly free? After nearly an hour of walking, they reached the edge of the forest. The snow-covered road that would take them away from the mountain was in sight. Tom let out a sigh of relief at the sight of the familiar path, but just as they were about to continue, he noticed something strange on the ground ahead. Footprints. Tom stopped in his tracks, his entire body tense. The footprints in the fresh snow were clear, as if they had just been made. They didn't come from the forest. They didn't lead toward them. Instead, they began in the middle of the road and led back into the forest. He glanced at Jess, and the terror in her eyes told him she had seen them too. "No one else is here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It can't be." Tom took a step toward the footprints, examining them closely. They were large, deep, and the snow around them seemed slightly melted, as if some residual energy had been left behind. His heart raced, and a horrible realization began to settle over him. "She didn't leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's still hunting us." Jess gasped, the reality of what that meant hitting them like a freezing gust of wind. They hadn't escaped. The creature wasn't satisfied. Daniel's sacrifice had only stalled it for a while. Now, it wanted more. Without another word, Tom and Jess started running down the road. The snow, which had felt like a minor obstacle before, now seemed to pull them back, as if the very ground wanted to keep them on the mountain. The sound of their boots crunching in the snow echoed in the silence, but Tom could feel it. The same oppressive sensation of being watched was back, stronger than ever. They knew now the terror hadn't ended. That thing, the one that had stalked them to the cabin, was still following. And deep down, both of them understood that there was no escaping it. The shadow of that creature would follow them wherever they went, because once it had chosen its prey, it always found what it was looking for. The cycle never ended.